Good morning, everyone. It's time to get started with our class. If you would be opening your Bibles to Acts chapter 22. Acts chapter 22. Our study this morning is going to begin in verse 17. Acts 22, verse 17. Jared, would you lead us in prayer?
God and Father, we come before you this morning. Thank you so much for another opportunity that we have to dive into your word and learn more about you, dear Lord, and what you have done for us and will always do for us. We thank you so much for Brother Josh this morning, who will be leading us in this class discussion, not only Josh, but the other teachers as well. Please bless them and help them all to have a recollection of what they have prepared for each of us to hear. We thank you so much for your Son, for what he lived, for the sacrifice that he gave for each and every single one of us. Put aside the worries of this world and concentrate and meditate on all that we're here this morning. We ask all these things in your Son's name. Amen.
Amen. Well, Paul is in the city of Jerusalem. He's gone there for one of the mandatory Jewish feast days. We've talked quite extensively about the fact that he went there because he knew this was going to be a great opportunity for him to be able to reach out to a lot of people in one place. Well, after he goes and he meets with the elders of the church in Jerusalem, they come up with a plan that they believe will help diffuse some of the tension that some of the Jews have toward Paul because of some of the false accusations that have been made about him. They were saying that he was going into all of these cities there in Asia Minor and telling these former Jews that they essentially had to give up all of their customs, all of their traditions, everything about who they were, everything about their national heritage. Well, this was not the case. What he was teaching as he went into these places was that they were to give up those tenets of the old law. Now, there were certain customs and things of that nature that they were certainly at liberty to continue to observe simply as a part of their lineage, a part of their heritage. But of course, these things such as the sacrifices and the rituals and things of that nature, these were not aspects that they had to keep. These were not aspects that they were supposed to keep if they were becoming children of God. And so after conferring with the elders, they came up with a plan to have some individuals that would take a vow, but they never got to the point of being able to sound that vow aloud. Because after their 7 days of purification, which was required prior to the making of a vow, they went to the temple, and a vow has to be made in person before a priest. Well, they never got to the priest. Because as we saw last week, as they came into this temple complex, many of those Jews from these cities in Asia Minor that had been persecuting Paul all along the way, they saw him and immediately they started a ruckus. This is the man. This is the one that we've been telling you about that's been stirring everybody up. That's been saying that we do not need to respect our traditions. We don't need to respect the temple. All of these things that they were saying, trying to discredit Paul. Well, they go and they seize him. They drag him out of the temple and they commence to beat him. And there's indication in the text that their intention was to beat him to death. They weren't going to stop until he had breathed his last. You know, there's some indication that some of these men, and I think there's a very strong probability, that some of these individuals that had seized him, had drug him out of the temple, were some of the ones that had drug him out of another city and tried to stone him to death. And so now their intention is they're going to finish the job. And the only thing that saved Paul at this time was the Roman officials. The commander over the garrison of soldiers there in Jerusalem, he heard about this uproar in the city. He knew that his job and the job of these soldiers was to maintain the peace. And so they go down. The crowd immediately separates themselves from Paul. They seize him. They have to carry him because this crowd is so violent, acting so strongly against Paul, that they have to literally pick him up and carry him up toward the palace, up toward where the dungeon would be located. Well, as they're going up these steps, as they get to the door leading into the palace, Paul looks at this commander and he says, "Can I address the crowd?" Well, the commander's taken aback because he does not speak Aramaic. Aramaic was the common language of the Jews at the time. This was a man that, by his estimation at this point, was just a Jew like all of these others. And so his expectation would have been that he would have spoken the common language of the Jews. But no, he spoke Greek. Greek was the language of commerce. It was the language of the political structure of the day. And so he recognized that there was something significant about Paul. And we talked some last week as well about the fact that this man kind of had the belief that this was a man from Africa, a man from around Egypt that had come into Jerusalem several years before during the reign of Nero, had really stirred up a mess, tried to overthrow Rome, and then disappeared. And he was thinking, well, this man has come back and he's stirring the people up again. Well, Paul tells him, no, I'm not that man. I'm not who you think that I am. But then he's allowed to address the people. So Paul, he's here. He has probably thousands of people within earshot of his voice. He cannot pass up this opportunity. And so he begins to defend himself, but also to explain to them how he got to where he was. And he starts out talking to them about the fact that they knew about his past life. They knew that he was raised in Jerusalem, that Gamaliel, this great Jewish rabbi, had been the one that had taught him. He was very strict in his adherence to the old law, and so much so that he had even persecuted the church because he saw them as being opposed to the will of God. But he says that as he was going to Damascus, and all of us have read and heard this story probably many times, but as he was going to Damascus to expand this reign of terror that he was bringing upon the church, suddenly a bright light from heaven shone around him, and he heard a voice. We understand this to be the voice of Jesus. And Jesus asked him the question, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" Well, immediately he did not know exactly who this voice was, but he recognized that it had to be coming from divine origin. And so he asked the question, "Well, who are you, Lord?" By indicating he recognized that this was someone that was superior to him. This subject, or this word Lord, also is indicative of the word master, someone that he recognized that he was to be answering to. And Jesus responded to him that he was Jesus, the one that Saul was persecuting. Saul was then told to go on into the city of Damascus. There he would be told what he needed to do in order to make his life right. Ananias came to him, told him that he needed to get up, be baptized, have his sins washed away, calling on the name of the Lord, indicating his faith in Jesus Christ. Hence, before someone is baptized, we ask them to make the good confession. Do you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God? Yes. So now, what Paul has done, he has brought them through his life story up to the point that he become a Christian. Now, most of these individuals who were there, they would have been familiar with his life story up to the point of his conversion, because he was raised around many of them. He was seen as the poster child, so to speak, of strict Judaism at the time. And so he would have been very well known. People would have known about Saul. And so now as we come to verse 17, he says, "Now it happened when I returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple that I was in a trance and saw him saying to me, 'Make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, for they will not receive your testimony concerning me.'" And so after he stays for a little while there in Damascus, he spends some time with the brethren there, he travels back to Jerusalem, goes back to a place where people are familiar with him. He goes into the temple, and he says that while he's there, he falls into some type of a trance. He goes into this mental state that is what we would say beyond the normal mental state of a human being. And he said that as a result of that, Jesus was able to come and communicate a message to him. And that message was, you do not need to stay in Jerusalem. The people here, they're not going to listen to you. They're not going to convert. So you need to get up quickly. You need to get out of town. Well, continuing, verse 19, "So I said, Lord, they know that in every synagogue I imprisoned and beat those who believe on you." And so he's indicating, he says, in all of these synagogues in the city of Jerusalem, and there were hundreds of different synagogues in Jerusalem at this time. He said, I'm known by all of the Jews here. And what he's indicating there is the fact that he felt, because of his notoriety, that he would be effective in that place. These were people that knew him, knew of his background, that these are individuals who had trusted him. And so he felt that he would be a success in Jerusalem. That they would listen to the things that he had to say. That they would convert to Christ. Well, Jesus tells him, he says, this is not the case. They're not going to listen to you. They're not going to convert. And continuing in verse 20, "And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I also was standing by, consenting to his death and guarding the clothes of those who were killing him." He said, I was present for some of the most significant events that have taken place in Jerusalem in regard to Christianity up to this point. He said, I was there. I was giving consent. I was agreeing with all of these people. And most people agree that this statement that he guarded over the garments is indicating that he was in some position of authority at this point. He was not the one that was actually carrying out the execution, but he was the one that was giving them the authority or giving them the charge to carry out the execution of Stephen. He was standing there watching it take place, endorsing what was happening, and he was there guarding the garments of those who carried out this act. And so again, he's saying, I am an infamous individual. All of the Jews in Jerusalem would know who Saul of Tarsus was. And so again, he felt like that this would be the most effective place for him to be. Well, there are other passages of Scripture, and also anyone that has ever attempted to preach, you know that one of the most difficult audiences to try to work with, to try to influence, are those who have known you all your life. This is why you very, very seldom, I'm not going to say never, but seldom, do you see someone who was raised in a certain congregation who is able to then, after they grow up, go back and have a strong, effective ministry with that congregation. Now, I know here at Pyburn, you had G.W. Allison that was here many times. He grew up here. He had a great ministry here. But that's the exception to the rule. Very seldom do you see that type of scenario being able to work. And there's a lot of different reasons behind that. We won't go into that. But Paul, he was looking at that thinking, you know what? These are my people. These are the ones that I grew up around. These are my family members. These are the ones that have known me from birth, essentially. If anybody's going to listen to what I have to say, it's going to be them. Jesus said, no, it's not going to work that way. They're not going to listen to you, even though they know you, even though they know what you've accomplished. They're not going to listen to you. And when I look at this passage, so often my mind goes back to the time of Samuel in the Old Testament. You remember Samuel was the last judge over Israel. And when the people began to cry out wanting a king, Samuel went to God. He was upset. He believed that the people were rejecting him, rejecting his authority. You remember what God said in response? He said, Samuel, they have not rejected you, they've rejected me. And so what we're seeing here is the same type of scenario. Jesus is saying to him, essentially, the people are rejecting me. And anyone that comes to Jerusalem preaching about me is going to have a very difficult road out. Jerusalem was using a more modern term, was the hotbed of Judaism. That's where the temple was. That was the place where the high priest was. The religious fervor in that city toward the old law, I would say, would be even stronger than the fervor that Paul had witnessed in Ephesus with the devotion to Diana. Centuries of people in that city had been following the old law. And so Paul, he felt like that he would be effective, but Jesus, he said, he says, at this time, he said, people in this city are pretty hostile toward me. And anybody that comes preaching about me is going to have a very difficult time. But what we're going to see as we go along, and what Paul is going to reveal to us here, Jesus is going to reveal to him now something that he never intended to engage in. We often talk about Paul being the apostle to the Gentiles. Well, Paul's going to reveal to us that his intention was never to go to the Gentiles. His intention was to work among his people. That's why he went to Jerusalem. But let's continue on. Verse 20, or verse 21. Then he said to me, depart, for I will send you far from here to the Gentiles. So Jesus reveals to him, he says, my intention for you is not to work with the Jews. The Jews are rejecting me. Most scholars, and one that I think of is Brother Guy Woods. Many of you probably remember that name from years ago. He made a statement in one of his commentaries that really struck me as being very wise. He said, from the time that Jesus was standing before Pilate and the Jews made the statement, we have no king but Caesar, the heart of that nation was turned away from God. Now that does not mean that over time some of the Jews did not convert, but pretty much at that point, that's when God rejected that nation. And that's when they began their decline, which ultimately led to the destruction of Jerusalem. But Jesus tells Paul, he says, don't stay in Jerusalem. Get out of here as fast as possible. I don't intend for you to work among the Jews. I'm going to send you a long way away from here. And I want you to work with the Gentiles. Well, notice what happens at this point. In verse 22 it says, and they listened to him until this word. And then they raised their voices and said, away with such a fellow from the earth, for he is not fit to live. So up to this point, they've really not had an issue with the things that he said. They're silent. He talks about his conversion. He talks about his intention to work with the Jews. But notice what it was that stirred him up when he said that he was going to take the gospel to the Gentiles. We have to remember that to a Jew, a Gentile was essentially a lesser creation. They were not on the same level of humanity as a Jew. Jews were to have nothing to do with the Gentiles as they were taught under their law at this time. Of course, we know this was a perversion of the old law. But the fact that this man had the intention of coming and working with the Jews, I find it interesting that that's not what set them off. That's not what upset them. Because here was a man who was a Jew, and if he came and he was preaching to other Jews and those Jews rejected him, that would be no different than any of the other teachers that had come teaching other things. But essentially now that they're hearing that Jesus has told him, don't waste your time with the Jews. They're not going to listen to you. You're going to go to the Gentiles. That's what got them upset. And so once again, when they hear this, they say, you know what? This man does not deserve to live. He needs to die. Get him out of here. We don't want to see him. We don't want to hear him anymore. And so what this commander decides that he's going to do, he wants to continue this interrogation of Paul. He wants to learn more about what has taken place. But the way that he decides that he's going to do this is he's going to have Paul beaten. And essentially what was going to take place was he was going to be beaten in much the same way that Jesus was prior to his crucifixion. He was going to be flogged. And what they thought, what their ways of interrogation were, he would be flogged for a short period of time. Then they would stop and they would ask him questions, trying to get information out of him. Well, as the text continues, notice that it says, and they bound him, 24. I'm sorry, I'm all confused this morning. 23. Then, as they cried out and tore off their clothes and threw dust into the air, the commander ordered him to be brought into the barracks and said that he should be examined under scourging, so that he might know why they shouted so against him. And so, trying to placate the crowd, he said, you know what, I'm going to take this man, I'm going to punish this man, I'm going to find out what's going on. I'm going to take care of the issue for you. Well, this is what the crowd wanted. They wanted him gone. They did not want him there influencing the people in any way. And so 25 says, and as they bound him with thongs, Paul said to the centurion who stood by, is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and uncondemned? Now let's stop right there for just a moment. What did this commander or this centurion have done to Paul as soon as he came and seized him from the Jews? We talked about that last week. Bound him with 2 chains. Now, he's brought into this palace. He's going to be questioned while being scourged. And this centurion gives the charge to bind him once again. Well, up to this point, this centurion has in his mind that this man is just a Jew. And as a Jew, the Romans can treat him however they want to treat him. Well, as he is being bound, Paul turns to the centurion and he says, is it in keeping with your law to treat a Roman citizen this way? I can imagine that all the air left the room at that point. This centurion was doing everything that he could to try to keep the peace. He felt like he was doing everything within the course of his laws to rectify this situation. And now he finds out that he has just broken Roman law 2 times. Roman citizens were not allowed to be bound. Even if they were found guilty and had committed some type of terrible crime, it was seen as below the level of civility of a Roman citizen to be restrained in that way. And so now this centurion has broken the law that he has sworn to uphold 2 times. Well, in verse 26 it says, when the centurion heard that, he went and told the commander, saying, take care what you do, for this man is a Roman. And so the centurion, the man who is over one of the regiments within this garrison of soldiers, the one that is going to carry out this punishment and this interrogation, as soon as he hears Paul say that he is a Roman citizen, he runs back to the commander. He says, you know what, you need to be careful with the way that you treat this man. This man claims to be a Roman citizen. Well, I'm sure that the commander kind of goes into panic mode at this point. He knows what has already taken place. He knows that he has broken the law. And so in verse 27, the commander came and said to him, tell me, are you a Roman? So he wants to hear it for himself. Are you a Roman citizen? And Paul responded, yes. You know, we talked a little bit, it was either last week or the week before, about how Paul came to be considered a Roman citizen. He was born in a Roman province. He was born in a city, the city of Tarsus, that was a Roman-occupied city at that time. And even though his lineage was that of a Jew, his national citizenship was Roman. And so, verse 28, the commander answered, with a large sum, I obtained this citizenship. Now, something that was quite interesting, many of those who were pressed into service in the Roman military, many of them were not Romans by birth. But there were a couple of ways that through their military service, they were able to earn Roman citizenship. And as a result of that, they had additional rights, additional blessings, things of that nature that were extended to them. One of the ways is they were to serve for a certain length of time. If they served for a certain number of years, they would automatically earn their Roman citizenship. Another way that they could do that would be through battle. If they fought in a certain number of battles, then they could earn their citizenship. Or, as we see mentioned here, they had the ability to purchase their Roman citizenship. And one of the sources that I read on this said that the way that they would purchase their Roman citizenship is they would forego any type of salary. Rather than being paid for their time serving in the Roman army, they would buy Roman citizenship. That would be considered their salary. And so, more than likely, from the way this text words, this commander is one that falls in this third category. One who is not being paid for his service, but is one that has obtained his Roman citizenship by essentially giving his income, giving his salary in order to obtain this. Well, Paul responded back to him and says, well, I was born a citizen. So now, this commander, he's indicating the fact, and some people believe, and I think that there's some strong evidence to support this, that more than likely This man was of Greek origin because he recognized and was able to fluently speak the Greek language when Paul spoke to him. But Paul says, you know what? I didn't become a citizen like you did. I was born a citizen. It's kind of like when someone comes to the United States and wants to become a United States citizen. There's a process that they go through in order to obtain that citizenship. But I don't see anyone here this morning that was not born a U.S. citizen. We were all born in the United States. Our parents were United States citizens. And so we automatically were considered that. Well, that's what Paul's saying that he was. And really, the way that the text reads, it's almost as if Paul is telling this Roman soldier, I'm more of a Roman than you are. I was born a Roman citizen. You had to earn your citizenship in some way. And so again, when you add this information, this just adds insult to injury to what has already taken place. This was not someone who became a Roman citizen later in life. This was someone that had been a Roman citizen all his life. And now he's being treated like a common criminal. Verse 29 says that immediately those who were about to examine him withdrew from him, and the commander was also afraid after he found out that he was a Roman and because he had bound him. So immediately these soldiers who were about to scourge this man, who were about to, as we would say, try to force a confession out of him, they drop everything and they run away. They don't want anything to do with this. They don't want to be associated with doing anything illegal. And notice it says that even this commander is now afraid. And he's afraid because he knows that he's broken the law. He's done something that he was not allowed to do. Well, in verse 30, it says the next day, because he wanted to know for certain why he was accused by the Jews, he released him from his bonds and commanded the chief priests and all the council to appear, and brought Paul down and set him before them. So, wanting to understand what's taking place, wanting to understand what the charges are that the Jews have against him, he requests a special audience with the Sanhedrin Council. He asks these leaders of the Jews to come together so that he can hear this matter and come to a proper judgment of what needs to take place. Well, once they've all come together, he brings Paul in. Paul sits there before the council. And that's where we're going to stop for this morning because we're out of time. But Lord willing, next Sunday morning we'll pick up there in chapter 23 and verse 1.